And thanks for joining us today. I'm Jane O'Connor, Vice President and Head of Sustainability at Taft Communications. Taft is a purpose-oriented communications firm based in New Jersey with national and international reach. We specialize in working with clients to help them articulate their purpose and engage their internal and external stakeholders around it. Today's program is the second in a series we're hosting on critical areas for organizational purpose. Our first was in December and centered on communicating about racial equity in the workplace. We plan to offer more of these learning and listening opportunities, bringing together experts for insight and inspiration, and of course, providing takeaways that you can use to forward purpose initiatives at your own organizations. If you like what you hear today, follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, where we'll keep you informed about upcoming programs and trends in the purpose space. During today's webinar, we encourage you to share your thoughts using the chat function and to ask questions using the Q&A tab. I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Ted Deutsch, Taft CEO. Before spending the past 9 years on the agency side, Ted led communications, public affairs, and culture initiatives at major corporations, including Sandoz, Realty, and Avis Budget Group. Ted?
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the more than 150 leaders who've chosen to join us today for what should be a really interesting conversation. And thank you, Jane, especially for all your work around sustainability communications, particularly the Rethink Energy campaign, which Jane has led for the last several years that many of you in the Mid-Atlantic region may be familiar with. Taft is really proud to bring this group together to talk about such an important issue. When I started my career in the 90s, corporate social responsibility, DEI, sustainability, they were present within companies, but they were a bit more of a side concern. And it's been encouraging that over the years, they've become more and more a central part of the strategy for how companies look to succeed. And the fact that we have so many influential people like our panel at the table driving important decisions of their companies is evidence of that. We also see the growing role of ESG, environmental, social, governance concerns in driving investment decisions. That's, of course, a big part of the picture here. Trillions already invested through ESG funds, another 20 trillion estimated to be going through those funds over the next couple of decades. And you combine that with the fact that millennials, Gen Zers have in survey after survey confirmed that they care more about their paycheck and even what their company produces, but also what their company stands for, and they want to work for purpose-driven employers. And that brings us to today's topic, which is how do companies that might be doing the right thing to protect the planet already, but how do they also make sure that's woven into the culture of the company itself and how employees can feel engaged around that sustainability mission. And we got a great group to do it. Let me introduce them. First, Andrew Winston. He's a best-selling author, thinker. He's written several books, including Green to Gold, which was really a trend-setting book a decade or more ago. He's a founder of Winston Eco Strategies. And I should note, Andrew's got a new book coming out in the fall, co-written with former Unilever CEO Paul Pullman. It's called Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. Look for that this fall. Welcome, Andrew. Next, Allison Khan, Vice President of People and Culture Communications. It's a great title, at MasterCard. Thank you and welcome, Allison. From the biopharmaceutical sector, and our neighbor in Central Jersey, Victoria Emmerich. She is the Global Head of Sustainability Strategy and Operations at Bristol Myers Squibb. Welcome, Victoria. And last but certainly not least, Jim Gowan, Senior Vice President of Global Supply Chain Operations and Chief Sustainability Officer for Verizon. Welcome, Jim. And I'll point out that this group together represents well over 200,000 employees worldwide. So they really bring a great perspective on today's topic. So thank you all for being here, panel and attendees. Just to remind you how we're going to run this, I've got some questions I'm going to pose to the panel during the first half of our program. We've had some discussions leading up to this, so I know they've got great insights, both general and concrete. And we will store up some questions and leave time at the end to take a few of your questions. Please send them through the QA function. And if you want to chat amongst yourselves, the chat function is open for that purpose as well. So let's get started. I'd like to begin with Andrew as we dive into the discussion today. Andrew, you've been watching and writing about trends in sustainability for years. Help us frame why ESG matters really are taken more seriously by organizations today than they have been in years, and what are the table stakes for engaging employees around those issues?
Well, great. Thanks for the question. And thanks for having me, Ted. It's good to be here. And I see the list of people. It's a great list. And I'm glad to be a part of this. Look, the pressures on business have been rising, for years and years, and I think have accelerated in the last couple of years in particular. I think more has changed in the last 2 years on the role of business in society, what it means to be a business, than the kind of 20 years before that I've been in this field. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I do study megatrends or gigatrends or whatever you want to call it. And there's a series of kind of the big grand challenges that are facing society. And on the social side, I know we're focused on environment today, but on the social side, inequality is really the core of it. And within that is racial inequality, gender, disabilities, everything. But on the environmental side, there's really these, truly existential threats that are forcing us to rethink how our economy works, how business works, how we live our lives, because they're threatening the pillars of our society and our economy. This is fundamentally climate change and biodiversity. And we're weakening the biodiversity kind of pyramid that we're a part of. And climate is obviously changing entire regions, right? We're heading towards a place where many cities, many locations will be uninhabitable. And I think some of that is already baked in, places that will be either too hot or underwater. So these have been issues for years. So what's changed? Why are companies talking about it? Well, I think in part because these megatrends, they're being felt finally. Climate was a model to debate for a long time. And in the last few years, it's not debatable. There's these massive fires causing people to flee, damaging entire industries going on all over the world. And companies are just seeing the impact and expense in their own operations and value chains. It's just impossible to deny this anymore. There's also kind of the upside, which is always what I think drives business to change the fastest. And so the other kind of category of megatrend is just what's going on in the clean economy. This movement away from old ways of powering our society, and the clean technologies that are becoming more and more dominant have gotten radically cheaper, especially in the last 10 years. Solar, wind, batteries down 80-90% in cost, so that it's basically cheaper to use these technologies now than before. So there's just fundamentally no excuse anymore, because between the cost to business and the expected cost to society, Swiss Re just released some numbers that said we're on track with the warming to lose about a fifth of GDP by 2050. And again, that understates that in some places, if you can't live there, it's 100% of GDP. But these are big numbers, multi-trillion-dollar numbers. And when you look at the costs and then the benefits, it's just become, the calculus has changed. It just makes no sense not to be heading down this path. And then increasing the pressure is just a series of stakeholders, right? And investors has become one of them, which is, even the way you framed the question when you said you've been watching sustainability and ESG, the use of the word ESG is a total investor framework. And it's come in to be almost synonymous with sustainability in the last couple of years because investors are finally at the table. And that's for good and bad. I kind of don't want the investor perspective to be the dominant one, because the case just isn't just about shareholder value in some short time frame. It's a larger case than that. So we're moving towards more and more investment in this. The investors are on board, but I think the stakeholder that provides the most pressure that I hear from companies is employees, and this is where we get into the culture question. Even companies that, frankly, the CEO or the executives aren't sure about this, they don't totally believe it, they know their employees do, and in particular the younger ones, right? The data is showing very clearly, 9 in 10 Gen Zers think a company has an obligation to solve environmental and social problems. It's part of doing business. And you can see companies like Amazon, some of the tech companies, where employees have changed the company's focus on these issues. Amazon did nothing on climate for years, and then employees marched out. They started their own kind of pressure group, and Amazon started to take more of a leadership role. So, what are table stakes for engaging them? I think showing the commitment, having serious science-based goals on carbon, waste, water, all the environmental footprint, showing you get it and you're putting in the effort and you know where you need to head along with the science. And then I think for employees, there's kind of a few key things. It's showing an understanding of these big impacts, understanding them across your value chain, understanding where you have an impact on things, demonstrating action and values, not just setting goals, but walking the talk in the business and as the leaders, the actual executives themselves, showing they get this and are bringing it into their own lives and the way they operate. It's engaging in policy, showing your employees that you're on the right side of policies on, say, like a climate bill or a price on carbon at the local and national level. And finally, it's just bringing, inviting people to bring their full selves to work and have purpose as part of their work and have it be synced with the purpose of the organization and letting them be citizens. You see companies signing, a ton of companies signed a time to vote agreement where they let their employees leave on US election day to vote. Some paid them to be poll workers. And you're seeing some companies encourage their employees to be activists on climate and other things. I think letting people be themselves is probably the deepest cultural driver of change and raises the loyalty of employees, and it changes the performance of the company. So I'll leave it there. It's kind of a setup, and we'll come back to, I'm sure, most of these things.
That's great, Andrew. That's a terrific framework. And boy, 1/5 of GDP being threatened, that sure dramatizes what we're looking at. And in general, I'd say we're probably an audience somewhat preaching to the choir based on who would come to a session like this. I will tell you, though, as I'm about to turn to Jim, that in our quick pulse poll, only 38% of the attendees strongly agree that environmental sustainability is embedded in their culture. Now, the good news is another 38% agree. So, but how do we get to companies really imbuing that sense throughout their organization? And I'd like Jim to take that first, particularly as with a service and tech company and a very large global footprint. What's your approach?
Yeah, so first off, Ted, thanks for the invitation, and everyone at Taft, really appreciate this opportunity. And then also, Andrew, I feel like you've been reading some of our internal employee results from our surveys. Spot on with your comments. So at Verizon, we go by the mantra of we create the networks that move the world forward. That's who we're about, that's what we're about. But when we talk about networks, it's not just about the commercials of 4G and 5G and fiber. It's about the human networks. And when you think, as Andrew was even saying, at the society level, the communities where we work, where we live, but then we bring it all the way back down, and really to frame it up to your conversation and your question, Ted, it's about us. And we refer to ourselves as the V-teamers, with over 100,000+ employees in well over 80 countries around the world. It's about how do we build into our DNA sustainability. And we've been on a journey for over 10 years doing this. And it's about creating a responsible business. And as was mentioned earlier, it's about setting goals, no doubt about it. But goals are just one thing. You've got to track them, you've got to audit them, and you've got to be very transparent about them, which is something we've been highly, highly focused on. And then it's taking it the next step. It's got to be real and it's got to be tangible day in, day out. Because when you have people walking in and out of your buildings, in and out of your retail footprint, our wireless stores where our customers are at every day, our employees are at every day, it's about, are you providing on-site renewable energy, whether it's solar, whether it's fuel cell technologies? Are you enabling your employees to work green and live green, as we say, with EV charging stations? It's all about how we think about water. It's how we treat our cafeterias, removing plastics. And then it all the way gets down to the employees themselves. And one of the amazing things that we always talk about, we've got a grassroots collection of employees dedicated to the environment. And we call it a really crazy name, a green team. You become a green team member. And 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought it would ever be where it is. We're now over 50,000 strong in over 52 countries. And it's people that get it at the gut level. And again, I go back to the comments Andrew was making. We're seeing that difference in the workforce. I'm a proud Verizon employee for over 25 years. Just celebrated that. And, I grew up in this company, but now I look at the new generations of employees that we're bringing on, the freshly minted graduates and MBAers, and they are thinking differently than I did. And I will ever think, they don't have to be reprogrammed. Some of us do. So we're all about educate, engage, and, take that employee base, build it into the DNA level, be very visible, be very transparent. And if we're going to say something, we do it. In a company our size, when I was growing up, we did 150% of what we said we were going to do, but we only talked about 10% because you never wanted to expose yourself. Those days are over. We mentioned ESG. ESG, yes, has a very, very Wall Street type investor spin to it, but it's really changed. And investors have changed and they're demanding it at the same time. So I don't want to go much further than that, but what I'd like to say is it's got to end, it's got to start and end with the employees, and that's through every level of the corporation.
Great. Thanks, Jim. I like that notion of keeping it real, simple, direct. And when you have 50,000 employees who have joined a green team, clearly it's getting through. I want to turn to Allison, who works for a more service-oriented company, technology service-oriented company with less of a carbon footprint than a lot of more manufacturing-driven companies. Just to talk a little bit about how that dynamic plays out at MasterCard.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted, and thank you, Jim. I think our perspective really builds on some of the things that Jim was saying, and about baking those values into our DNA. Right, for us, it's not about ESG or environmental or racial equity or any of these sort of disparate parts that are, by the way, all inextricably linked and really critical to our ability to do business in the world and for our employees to thrive and to live and work in our communities and coexist and have a promising future. But we have a values-based system that I think everything sort of lends itself to and from. And so there's a natural alliance between the things we're talking about, the things we're doing, whether they're in the environmental, social equity, et cetera, space, and coming back to those values. We call it the MasterCard way. And that is something that we have built. There's a literal visual model that we reinforce at every turn with our employees, and inclusion is a piece of that, along with other values. And so when we've got these touch points, which yes, we're in in some ways a good starting place because we don't have the large carbon footprint, we don't manufacture anything, we don't have consumer facing storefronts, et cetera. But that's an opportunity for us and less a challenge, right? And that means that we can serve in a different role and serve in a helpful role in furthering our environmental and sustainability efforts. We can play that role of convener. We've built, for instance, Priceless Planet Coalition, where we bring together other companies and other players in the space with a commitment to restore 100 million trees over the next 5 years. Many examples like that. We just, for instance, created, as a technology company, we can play that role of innovator and resource. We created a carbon calculator we just recently rolled out that goes to our issuing partners, the banks, and they can provide that as a tool and resource and added value to consumers so that everyday consumers like you and I can figure out what is our carbon impact on our everyday purchasing. So embedding all of these solutions across the board, and at every turn, employees are a part of that, from the actual creation of the ideas, the innovation, and the products and solutioning, and working with partners to build and sell. But then also, the company leaning on those values that we reinforce and making sure that we're delivering on our promises. And that's to create that digital economy for everyone everywhere. And we know that's all interconnected. We support farmers networks in Kenya so that people can connect to a digital economy, and micro and agricultural businesses can thrive. We know that's very much tied to global warming and to environment. All of these pieces, COVID-19 is connected to the environment, right? To deforestation the thinning of walls between wildlife and people. And all of these things impact our day-to-day lives as a company, as employees. So to continue to have that conversation, to look to solutioning, to be able to engage employees at every level on creating those solutions, on educating for those not involved on those solutions, and then helping to share the word out more broadly.
Great. Love all those innovative things you're doing, and this notion that it's not just top down, but generating ideas from employees on those innovations is really interesting to hear. So let's swing back more in the manufacturing direction, although it's science and medicine. Victoria would have a perspective from BioPharma and Bristol Myers Squibb, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ted. And thank you to everybody on the panel already, because you've really built a foundation on which we can readily layer our work on top. So for those of you that don't know us, Bristol Myers Squibb is a differentiated biopharmaceutical company focused on innovative medicines for patients with cancers and other serious diseases. And as a patient-centric company, we have an obligation to operate in a way that respects the environment, as Allison was just building the connection between environment and human health. So over the years, we've consistently aligned our sustainability approach to meet this mission of patient centricity, starting with our first commitments, which were actually published in 1987. So I'm pretty proud to say we laid the groundwork very early, and that has led to building this into, as you said earlier, our DNA and into our culture, and focusing on the patient as the center of the work we do and how the environment impacts that is approach that all of our employees can align on. So fully agree, this is about employee alignment and driving to a common set of goals. So our commitment to protecting human and natural resources has grown with our company, and through 20 years of public sustainability goals and reporting, where today we're operating over 200 facilities in over 50 countries around the world. And these vary from small leased office spaces to large complex manufacturing sites. So there's a lot of variety to manage and ways we have to go about doing this. And as a result, we're taking a tiered approach to our sustainability, our environmental responsibility efforts. We've established corporate enterprise goals, which I'll reference as we're setting our North Star. And those goals will provide the framework for different business units or even individual sites to develop and stand up their own sustainability programs. We heard the importance of empowering our people, and we agree with that. We're empowering our people through this process to drive innovation, to have the flexibility to accommodate unique technical aspects of a site, as well as to respect local cultures and local resources. So for us, there's really no one size fits all approach. Our corporate team acts as the navigation system, keeping the North Star in sight, while our at the operational level, our people who operate these facilities determine the best routes to take. So if you think about it, if you take a team of people leaving a single site, a single place, all headed to a restaurant, everybody takes a different route to get there. No one's going to take the same route, but you've set a destination and a time to get to that destination, and you empower people to decide the best way to get there. So the two good examples on how this translates into an operation like ours, one is in renewable energy. We have a manufacturing site in Switzerland that is leveraging the local resource of geothermal, while at a manufacturing site in Phoenix, we are working to increase our capacity to generate energy through the obvious, which is solar. Can't really use geothermal across the globe, and kind of not going to gain much if we're trying to use solar in Switzerland. For water, we have this is an interesting one. We have a large office complex, a very large office complex, in which we can recycle much of the water we use. While just down the road, we have an equally large manufacturing site for which recycling water is really not much of an option. So these sites will be the engineering and facilities and leadership of these sites from an operations perspective is common because of their geographical location, but they have to take very different approaches to meet the challenge of water reduction. So we find that taking this navigation system approach provides the flexibility and adaptability we need to manage a physical footprint such as ours. And we achieve success through weaving this patient-centric approach into proactive efforts to engage across teams, across sites, and across business units to drive ideation, share best practice, and what we were thinking of now is embody the how might we do approach.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. I like the language that you're using, this sense of navigation and North Star. And part of the point of this discussion is how do you communicate to employees where you're going and how you're organized to get there. I'd like to do another round the horn with our company reps and then come back to Andrew on sort of a bigger trend question. Jim, we were just talking globally on Victoria's side, specifically related to manufacturing. You've got, I think it's over 140,000 employees worldwide, and you have a CEO who happens to be very vocally out front on these issues. I'm just curious, how do you take into account different viewpoints around the world on sustainability when you're coordinating these things centrally for such a large global enterprise?
Well, it was a lot easier before COVID, I can tell you that much. But you're right. Hans Vestberg, our CEO, who's from Sweden, has just been absolutely fantastic. I tell everyone I struggle to keep up with him because he is always 5 steps ahead of me when it comes to environmental, social issues across the board. And, you know, growing up in Sweden and then having his multiple stops around the world, he's lived all over, is just incredibly encouraging for us to think about things differently. But from the top down and the bottom up, as we were talking about, you know, building it into your culture, it really comes down to when you think about a company with 140,000 employees in so many different locations, it's about that constant drumbeat of communication. When you think about people on a maturity scale, some of them are very, very passionate about it, the environment, passionate about, you know, doing more in their private time as well, to others who maybe didn't grow up in that world and are just learning. So from our perspective, it's all about community engagement. It's all about our recycling rallies. It's getting our people out into the communities where we work and live. But then it's also about a monthly newsletter. Again, constant drumbeat of communication. What are we doing as a company? And then it goes to social media, Verizon Green's website, hashtag on Twitter, you know, and the site there that is constantly updating people. We have quarterly green bag sessions where we have both internal or external experts come in to talk about everything from water to energy across the board. And then it's enabling our employees to then have solar programs, which could be sponsored by Verizon in certain states. But then again, allowing access to that. At the end of the day, the way we think about it is always coming back to constant communication, constant engagement, because if you don't do that, then you're gonna leave some people behind. And that is obviously not our goal across the board. I'll give you one more differentiation, and that is where we've been focused on finding our employee sweet spot. Regardless of whether you're a technician that'll go into a customer's home who would deploy our FiOS product, or someone who works in a store working with our customers there, it's what can you bring out of them? Because it's small steps. It's not the massive steps. Not everyone can sign a renewable energy program to get a gigawatt of solar energy or build solar energy like that. It's about enabling bike to work programs, green eating programs. It's about those volunteering activities. It's a holistic approach to engage everyone and keep that constant communication going. We deployed in 2020, it was a brand new opportunity, and we called it SCOPE, and it was Sustainable Communities Outreach Program. So obviously we operate across the entire United States here, but it was about taking 5 specific cities and looking at things, everything from local tree planting to local cleanups to environmental activities, and actually marrying that also with the way we're rolling out our 5G services as well in those cities as well. So again, it's just a little bit more of a hyper focus on a certain area, and those scope cities will keep doing 5 more each year. We've had requests to do more, but you know, resources are what they are. But those are just another example of that constant drumbeat, constant communication, and a consistent message. And I always go back to what Andrew said up front, which is you have to set those lofty goals. we're going to be net zero on our operations by 2035 of our scope 1 and scope 2. Then we have to give those incremental things. We have to do those big things. We have to reduce water. We have to reduce electricity. Those are just the table stakes. It's these other things where you're enabling the constant communication and bringing it into your day-to-day. That's the game changer.
But you know, when you say constant communication, that's music to our ears. And I'm sure you're all having to partner with communications to make sure that all that good work is known by employees so they can engage. And you mentioned emotion earlier, and I want to come back to Victoria on who I know in our prior discussions you talked about there's a lot of emotion fraught on these topics. You also brought up the interesting point that Bristol Myers Squibb's just gone through a major integration, bringing Celgene under the Bristol Myers Squibb tent, and how that could be a risk factor, but it could also enable an even deeper push around sustainability. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Absolutely. So at Bristol Myers Squibb, we recognize that our people drive our culture, and they also drive our sustainability. And in the last few years, we've actually are going through 2 integrations. One is Celgene, and the other is another company a smaller company called Myocardia, but just as important from a culture perspective. So we're now seeing the impact of the integration of 2 cultures into our company. And our new colleagues, what we're seeing is they bring their experience, they bring their expectations, and they bring their ways of working and their ways of approaching sustainability. So it's a really exciting time. It's full of energy, it's full of opportunity. But what we're also finding, as you mentioned, is that there aren't too many topics inside the workplace that will stir the emotion of the individual, quite like environmental responsibility. And I think that's in part due to people, every individual can see how they can make change, and they can see what's not happening around them. It's very tangible. So this level of excitement, we're now just over 30,000 in our total employee base. So this can result in an empowered, if we were really organized in our communications and in our structure, it can result in an empowered and enthusiastic army of 30,000, or it can be like herding 30,000 cats, all with solar panels in their hands. So ideally, we have the empowered army, but I think as James had mentioned and others, the reality is we will have a mix of both. There's going to be some structure and there's going to be some individual interests. So we do apply the same navigation system approach, and we focus on building teams of like-minded colleagues. We found a great way to do this is through offering employees the ability to and the flexibility to focus on their areas of interest, and build teams that make them be able to kind of build a density of abilities and grow and influence others on key areas of interest while ensuring there's an overall alignment to our patient-centric business objectives. We leverage our business-led employee engagement groups, which now are prevalent through most companies. And for sustainability, our most prolific groups are, like Jim's, our Go Green team, and also as mentioned earlier, our employee resource group, or what we call a people business resource group for CLIMB, which is cultivating leadership and innovation for millennials and beyond. And the CLIMB team actually created a CSR sustainability group within their organization, specifically to coordinate efforts around the globe. In addition, we actively engage with our employees through the UN Global Compact initiatives, and a really good one that drives employee engagement, probably more than anything else I've seen, is leveraging the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And one way, a great example, we have started utilizing the employee engagement app, Virgin Pulse. And this is traditionally used by employees to track progress related to wellness, but we've expanded the content to include a section on sustainability. So employees can track progress and earn points, and therefore earn money or rewards, not just for wellness efforts, which we fully support, but also for sustainability work. We're actually seeing, what's interesting, people aren't just tracking their progress as an individual, they're building teams and they're self-designing challenges maybe within a department or between departments around the world. So it's really interesting. And our climb team is currently running what they're calling a calendar challenge through this app, which involves both environmental and social activities throughout the year. And I think we just started this in January, and even with COVID, I think we have upwards of 2,000 people already actively engaged in this calendar challenge.
Right. Wow. Well, so many good creative ideas, and it's one of the reasons to have a session like this, that you're sharing best practices and people are picking up on them. And I keep hearing that theme of teams, energizing, activating teams. Allison, I know we talked about your SoPro program before the webinar. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, and just generally how you ensure that you can have a great sustainability initiative that's visible externally, but how do you make sure that internal audiences are considered for each one?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So, I actually just wanted to quick comment on Victoria's point. I think it was really interesting around the employee resource groups and a focus specifically there as kind of a convening point. It's something that we have a really engaged business resource set of groups at MasterCard as well. And it's interesting because we've identified that the one issue that cuts across all of the different identity categories within the groups is environment, and it's related to all of them. So we actually recently had a conversation where our chief sustainability officer came and talked to our global co-leads for all of the business resource groups across the globe and talked about how could we come together to do something that is specific to environment, but by the way, also very relevant to all of our groups and all of the sort of respective issues and concerns. So I think that's really interesting in that space. So SoPros is the proverbial digital convening, corralling of the cats. But that we have identified what I think is a pretty effective way that serves multi-purpose, two-way communication channel between employees, both for employees to get excited about because they are very excited and engaged around our sustainability work and our ESG work more broadly, our inclusion and diversity work. So for them to be able to easily leverage the news that's coming out and to help amplify it. So it's of benefit to employees to have content at the ready, and benefit to MasterCard to have employees as our best ambassadors amplifying the work. So SoPros it's essentially just our social media ambassador program. It's a digital-based push notification system. Anytime we've got news going out that is relevant to any number of things, but we have a heavy focus on our sustainability and inclusion work because that is what employees are very passionate about. And they get a push notification. They can easily personalize, adapt, and click a button and share on their social channels. More broadly, though, I think the important point, and for us, and one we take quite seriously, is to consider internal communications a part of the integral plan for rolling out news. And I think a lot of places tend to consider internal communications as an afterthought rather than from minute one when you're strategizing. And that means thinking about what are those components of any kind of external activation that you can adapt and roll out internally as well. And a recent fun example of that was around Earth Day. We ran a Plant It Forward campaign externally on social media where we would match up to $200,000 for people to plant trees in honor of their friends, families, colleagues. And then in parallel, we ran internally a campaign. We deposited it into a recognition program that we have 3 trees that every employee could gift forward to colleagues within the company. So, again, it's a way to create awareness about the things we're doing, but also to engage. And by the way, it goes beyond even just educating on our environmental and sustainability initiatives. It just deepens that culture of inclusion and that camaraderie, especially as so many of us are virtual in the past year.
Great. Thanks, Allison. I love that observation about environment cutting across all employee resource groups and how that can be a powerful way to engage employees. I'd like to come back to Andrew, to something you touched upon earlier, Andrew, this issue of how does racial justice and equity relate to sustainability. There may be some who think they sort of compete for the company's attention or compete for employees' attention. I think you see them as more connected. And I want to just weave into the question, Andrew, a question that I see has popped up on here about to what degree these concerns are affecting companies' decisions on government affairs, engagement with membership organizations, and lobbying, because I think it ties into the same question.
Yeah, well, I guess let me start with that last one. It should. I think advocacy is, it's something I've written about more and more over the last few years and seen as really critical for what the larger companies can be doing with their influence. And in the new book, we call it net positive advocacy, meaning, are you walking into the halls of power and just asking for a tax break or something that's going to benefit you narrowly? Or are you walking in saying, how do we work together to solve the larger problem, whether it's increased infrastructure for recycling, a better grid, the things that allow you to do more sustainable processes and operations? Are you going in and trying to make that happen at a policy level? And really importantly, as the question gets at, are you looking at your trade associations and the things, the other groups that are representing you? Because there's a massive disconnect, across a lot of companies. They have these really aggressive goals. They might have science-based goals. And then there's a trade association basically fighting any action on climate. This has been a problem. I think it's getting more transparent. It's harder to hide that, but it is. But back to the original question, I think, I spent the early part of my career in this field really focused on the green stuff, on the resource use, on climate. And just over time, it's just become clearer, in part because my clients and the companies I work with, the people doing these jobs in sustainability are getting more and more pieces of it in their area. They're getting diversity in the supply chain in addition to the footprint of manufacturing. Like there's just much more to the role and to what's called sustainability. And it is because everything's connected. And I think we've gotten much more nuanced about that in recent years, that the inequality and climate issues are deeply connected. I mean, the people who face the worst consequences from climate are the poorest, almost entirely. And we saw, something that was shocking, maybe not too unexpected, but incredibly shocking, the just unacceptable difference in outcomes on COVID by race and by class. And, radically different, right? 4 times the death rate for Latino Americans versus white Americans. It just unacceptable. So we're seeing that these things are deeply connected. And that's good and bad, right? It means you can't effectively address one without looking at systems, and systems are really hard. And it can mean that there's a vicious cycle to problems, but it also means that as you start to work on a system and one piece of it, you're also influencing another one. You can get a virtuous cycle going where you're improving multiple things at once. And I think that's the benefit of seeing the connections. But it's challenging. We're not taught to think in full systems. It's just not the way our education works. It's not really the way our brains work. We're very linear. So it's tough. And I think the topics like intersectionality are helping us kind of get that. And just literally having more diverse voices in the room, in the boardroom, in the meeting room helps, kind of help people see how things are all connected. So I have definitely heard executives say, oh, well, we got to have our response on racial equity after the George Floyd murder. We got to focus on that. We got to do everything at once. I mean, that's the reality. We can't pause on climate because there's a race issue. And I think part of the way is, again, to bring those issues together, like a Green New Deal, which is trying to get people jobs and help bring people out of poverty and solve climate issues because they're connected. So I think working on the systems is the answer to all this, but it's hard. That's the hardest work to do.
Thank you. And interesting, bringing it back to the Green New Deal and looking at it from a policy perspective, how these things are connected. And some argue they shouldn't be, some argue they should. I think you just made a persuasive case. Before I bring up a separate question that I see from the group, did anyone else want to drop in on that topic? Oh, Victoria.
I'll speak to it very briefly. I think I echo everything that Andrew said. And from Bristol Myers Squibb, obviously we're a healthcare company. We make medicines for patients with serious disease. There is very little differentiation between sustainability for us from a social and an environmental perspective. They have to come in hand. Social and environmental determinants of health are areas where we focus, and health equity is now how we pull it all together, and have announced significant commitments in the health equity space that align in capacity building, which Andrew was referencing, this deal with the system of the systematic approaches. And we think systems, because that's how biology works. Bringing these together from a company strategy, the health equity, the social determinants, diversity and inclusion, and then with our next generation environmental commitments, it pulls this package together that starts to address and take us down the path that Andrew was just describing.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Jim, I think you were trying to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I promised I wouldn't talk about my other part of my job, sustainability, supply chain. But since Andrew brought it up, he's spot on, because that ecosystem of a sustainable supply chain, specifically giving all the geopolitical challenges, the natural disaster challenges, the business continuity, that is really where you're bringing together everyone's day-to-day job, and then the globe becomes incredibly small. And we go on for hours on that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that aspect of a sustainable supply chain starts with your internal employees, and then really makes the world a smaller place. And it has to stay in focus, whatever the new political deal is, whether it's coming out of the UK or out of the United States, or tariffs, or whatever the case may be. But that's all.
Great, thanks. And it is so inextricably tied to supply chain. There's a question there, a couple of questions that hit upon a similar theme of how do companies that are newer to this, that are early on in their sustainability journey, maybe they're very small, what advice would you give them? And MasterCard, of course, I'm sure a lot of your customer base is smaller businesses that maybe are much less sophisticated than a company that's been doing it since 1987 or has 100,000 plus employees around the world. So I throw that to the group. If anyone would like to address your advice to early stage companies on the sustainability journey.
I'll take a crack. I have one that I've learned during I'm actually a research scientist by training, and I'm a recent addition into this space, only the last few years. And one of the things that I've learned that we've made the pivot in our mindset at BMS about, that I think what we're seeing from our small companies that we've acquired, that they brought with them, is the mindset of an ROI for a sustainability program. It's less about the return on the investment. Our legacy has always been, how much will I get? How can I save? And really now I think of ROI as the risk of inaction. And I think if you start with that, and worry less about how much money are you going to save, a penny here or a little bit here or there, but it's long term. What happens if you don't build these programs in place? And it's a lot cheaper to do it from the beginning than to do the retrofit or the remediation on the back end.
See a lot of heads nodding to that one.
Yeah, I would just add, it was actually to Jim's earlier point about just communicating on all cylinders all the time. I think if you're starting out, I've worked also in nonprofit and startup spaces running comms, and you can box above your weight, right? You can, you want to be obviously honest and accurate about the things you're doing, but communicate about them regularly, right? Communicate at all times to all your audiences about the things you're doing, and you will be able to build that awareness and that reputation, and that in turn can help inform the work as it grows.
I just add quickly that, obviously small and startup companies have some different dimensions than the multinationals, but there's a benefit, right? You're starting, so you can put this lens of sustainability or whatever dimension you want on everything from the beginning and start from there. But I think I just point out that so much of the work that big established companies have to do now, I think, is to locate their purpose, to find that kind of statement like Jim had at the very beginning about Verizon. Is so much more common. I forget what it was. It was connecting, and there was like a good phrase about what you do. And for a lot of companies, they have to kind of go dig in the history of like, what is our purpose? Why did we start? If you're a startup, like you're there. Like, why have you started? And kind of use that as the driver of everything you do going forward. Like, what are you existing for? Why does the world need you? And I think that's how you head on the way to kind of a value laden approach to business.
Jim wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, well, first off, I'm going to get an F from my PR team because Andrew couldn't remember it. So I didn't obviously hit
That's
the
my fault.
well enough. No, it's all good. But we create the networks that move the world forward. Just to wrap that one up, and he's spot on. It's all about purpose. But just 2 sentences. It's all about management 101. It's about listening. Doesn't matter whether you're large or small. It's finding what is your employee's passion, because that is, again, going with a variety, and that's the network effect. Because once you have people starting to think that way, whether it's simple, I lived at Jersey Shore, it's a beach cleanup. All of a sudden people start thinking about that, they bring it back in. And we go by work green, live green. What we talk about at work brings your backyard barbecues. And oh, by the way, what you hear at your backyard barbecues, bring them back to work. None of us have all the answers, and every little bit helps at the end of the day. I also say, last thing, listen to your kids or listen to the younger generation. They're getting it at the gut level where all of us are reprogramming ourselves. So that's all I'll say about that, Ted.
Listen to the next generation. Part of the next generation is already in the workforce, and some of them are coming soon. What we plan to do is use the last few minutes to do, I see we covered the questions that have come in. One around the horn, and you kind of probably covered a few of these already, but for the attendee here who pictures working for a company of some size or an organization of some size, the most critical concrete piece of counsel you'd give them in accelerating and sustaining their programs in this area, what would it be if you boil it down? You've all shared a lot of good advice. It could be a concrete idea. It could be a principle to stand by. So why don't we start with Allison, and then we'll go to Jim.
I don't know if this quite fits as a principle, but the word accountability is just one that I think is really critical, both in realizing any pledges or commitments you make, and that level of credibility with your employees in doing so, in particular, even putting aside external sort of reputational factors. And I think that comes back to what I said earlier around establishing that foundation of values, and you build everything on that. You've got to first build the values and make that clear. Everything should ladder up to it. Then you've got your education and awareness. You need to make clear why this journey is an important one to be on and why your brand is on it. And then you need to back it up with accountability. In a very tangible way, we recently announced executive compensation will be tied to our ESG goals moving forward. We're not the first company to do it, definitely not the last. More should come on board. But that's accountability. That's a strong message that gets sent to all employees, that this stuff isn't just speak, it's action. We're doing it. We're holding our leaders accountable.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Sure. I've got 5 kids, so I'm giving this comment out all the time. Choose your companies wisely. Andrew said it earlier, purpose-driven. We talk about a responsible business, but it's choose where you're going to work wisely. Make sure you're passionate about what you do. Focus on being collaborative. I think that's a word that a lot of us have kind of lost sight of. We become experts at what we do, but it takes a village. Collaboration is key. And then the last thing I'd say is pass it along. I sit on the board of 2 external cooperations, and I sit with many of my competitors. If you had told me in my career that I'd be sitting next to a table with my friends from AT&T or from Deutsch Telekom in Germany earlier, I would have said you're crazy. But at the end of the day, environmental issues are everyone's issues, and it's table stakes that we need to work together and choose to be as collaborative and as transparent as we can.
Environmental issues are everyone's issues. Strong reminder. Victoria?
So Allison and Jim took my 1 and 2. So So I will echo and absolutely support everything they've said. So I'm going to pivot. I'm going to take a little slightly different approach to answering the question as if I was a new employee coming into a company, and how might I affect change? And my recommendation, and I've kind of, no, we're not supposed to, but I'm looking at the chat, and yes, I did this, Julia. I've had to reinvent myself in a different role. I had to figure out how to drive change in a company I knew. And I think one of the things to think about from a sustainability perspective is take your ideas and understand how to connect them to drive impact that align to your company business, to your company mission. Because once it catches on, you can embed that in a long-term sustainable way. Versus we sometimes get people that have a great idea that is taking us way out of left field. You might get there, but you need to stay within the line of your business and really drive some momentum, and then let that carry you a little beyond the core focus of your business. Because I find that the management will honor and embrace in change within to improve the company business before you kind of go off and build a hut on the side to do something really interesting.
Interesting. I like that perspective from that new employee impact. Andrew, we're going to end with you at risk of throwing off what you're about to say. In addition to what you're about to say, how important is it for companies to be leading the way here, not just in their own carbon footprint, but in influencing the employees that they have this unique relationship with?
I mean, look, there's probably, a sense of the community, maybe NGOs that aren't thrilled with business think our big problems and government's got to solve them. There's the libertarian kind of just privatize everything, business will solve it. It's obviously neither of those. It's we have to do it together. That said, business really has to step up for a lot of reasons, but one is just the scale of business. It is that business and the markets are the vast majority of capital flows in the world, of job creation, of just the world. But it's also that global governance is kind of failing us. I mean, the Paris Climate Accords are amazing on some level, but they're not nearly enough. And our global institutions, like out of the UN, are like 80 years old. They're not really fit for today. And so business has a lot of reasons it really needs to step up, but it is to kind of co-lead with government. We're not going to solve these problems without policy, so that's partly the answer. I think that business just has to be a part of it and step up. But I think without saying we're going to lead, that sounds a little bit like arrogant on some level. Like, it has to be a partnership. And that kind of ties to what I was going to say about a priority. I mean, Jim said it earlier, basically just listening to your kids, to the next generation, but just inviting people in. I think we heard earlier about kind of an innovation jam, the kind of thing where you ask all tens of thousands of employees to chime in on something and say, where should this company go? What are the problems we can solve? And there's just some great stories of that. And that listening, I think is how you build a culture of fundamentally service, right? That a company that's really going to create good in the world is going to be in service of stakeholders. They're going to try to improve the well-being of their employees throughout their lives, help customers, obviously, but also serve your suppliers, serve the community, serve the governments that you're trying to work with, and start from that perspective to serve them, and the profits and the benefits to you will come. And that's kind of the crux of I think what we're calling a net positive company, is you have to be in service.
That's a great theme on which to end. I was going to summarize a lot of the key themes I heard. There's so many that I've circled that we may not have enough time, because you all hit on so many good points. We are going to write up a bit of a summary of the webinar that we'll make available through taftcommunications.com. I'm really grateful to Jim, to Andrew, to Victoria, to Allison for taking the time today and for what their organizations are doing. Talk about service. You're serving your organizations in such an important way, and ultimately serving your employees and the planet. And that's what we need. And I'm glad everyone emphasized the importance of communications in that process, and appreciate the time you've taken today, and for all the attendees who joined. And we'll be sharing the link with those who registered and couldn't join. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the spring weather and keep it sustainable.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.